Okay, welcome to those of you that are just joining us now. We will give everyone just one more minute and then we will get started on the webinar. Will? Oh. Okay, hi everybody. Sorry, I think a brief technical difficulties there. Let me just take 1 second to set back up our screen and we should be good to go. Okay, so thank you again for joining us. Before I run through our agenda and introduce our panel, I'd like to make a quick comment about technology. We will be recording this session and we will send out the link to all participants after today's session. And also, subject to time, we will try to take questions from you all today as participants. And you can submit these questions through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the session. We will, through that chat function, we will be curating those questions behind the scene and we'll do our best to incorporate them at the panel discussion. My name is Bob Larocca. I am the Director of Policy and Communications at Transforming Education, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I'm joined by three great panelists, Rick Miller, the Executive Director of the Core Districts, Noah Bookman, the Chief Accountability Officer of the Core Districts, and Heather Huff, the Executive Director of the Core PACE Research Partnership. So after I talk just very briefly about transforming education and what we do, I'm going to set the stage for this session and talk a little bit about why we believe the topic of social emotional learning is so critical and important right now. I will then hand it over to Rick and Noah, who will tell the story of the core districts, how they prioritized SEL measurement. And then Heather will conclude by briefly discussing the partnership that CORE has with PACE and their proposal to the state of California to serve as a research pilot to help inform ongoing state and federal accountability decisions. Finally, with the time remaining, we will have a panel discussion about SEL measurement and state policy, and then again, hopefully with enough time at the end for some of your questions. So let me start by providing just a little bit of background about our organization. Transform Ed supports school systems in assessing and developing the intra and interpersonal skills that students need to succeed in college, career, and life. And we do this by bridging the gap between the world of psychology, neuroscience, and education research with the school systems out there that want to act on that research now to serve their students more effectively. For example, we have served as strategic advisor to the core districts, as we're going to hear about, helping them to roll out their unique accountability and data measurement system that incorporated social emotional competencies. And we have the great opportunity to work with an amazing set of researchers around the country, including Tom Kane and Marty West of Harvard, Camille Farrington of CCSR, Mark Brackett of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, Roger Weisberg of Castle, and many others. And we do have 2 free publications that we've recently released in the past couple of months. The most recent is a policy brief that discusses the opportunities that we feel the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, provides to advanced social-emotional learning. And within that policy brief, we provide a few specific recommendations for state and local leaders on how to act on that. And then the other is a case study about the work of the core districts. And you'll notice today a lot of overlap between the conversation we're going to have and that case study. But I should add that the case study also provides links to select tools that states and districts and leaders may use to learn from to adapt or replicate components of the core district's approach. And you can find both of these available, again, for free, available for download at our website, transformingeducation.org/resources. So we want to lead this off by just talking about why SEL in this conversation is particularly relevant now. We're going to get into the specifics of why SEL measurement matters in a bit, but I'd like to provide some context for why we're holding this seminar. And the first thing that we want to note is that the research base on these skills is really, really compelling. We see consistently that these skills impact students' career, academic, and well-being outcomes. So with respect to academics, we see that students with stronger social-emotional, or SE, skills are likely to perform better academically. They're more likely to complete both high school and college. With respect to careers, stronger SE skills predict a greater likelihood of being employed, as well as higher earnings and greater financial stability. And then finally, with regard to lifelong well-being, individuals with strong SE skills are less likely to struggle with health issues such as obesity, smoking, substance abuse, and mental health issues as well. And all of this is summarized in a paper that we've written called Ready to be Counted. It is also available on our website, and it is also free to download. So the first reason why we think SEL, this conversation matters so much, is because of the compelling research. Another good reason, and there's many reasons, but the other one that we want to highlight today is the passage of ESSA in December. The passage of this sweeping education law sets forth some very serious implications and opportunities for social-emotional learning. So as you can see here, I've got a few bullet points on important themes of ESSA, and you'll see, I think, through this conversation today, how it relates to social-emotional learning measurement and the advancement of that. ESSA devolves more power and decision-making to states and to local authorities, providing them with the flexibility to expand the definition of student and school success. And it also, throughout the law, emphasizes the use of evidence-based approaches. And thirdly, it establishes the opportunity to incorporate SEL measures into state systems, either for accountability purposes, formative purposes, or in other words, continuous improvement, or for public reporting. And so it's with these two reasons that we know SEL competencies matter to student success, for one, and secondly, that ESSA exists and can be leveraged to advance those competencies, that we're here today and we're excited to have this conversation. And I think there's no better way to further that than to talk about districts that have done this work, that have prioritized a set of SEL competencies and then measure them in a systematic way. And so at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Rick and Noah to guide us through the story of CORE and the great work that they've done.
Great, thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate Transforming Ed is making this venue available to us. We're looking forward to this conversation. Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon from Sacramento, California, which is where I am, and working with the core districts. So a brief background on the core districts. CORE is a group of 8 school districts, mostly large urban districts in California, that at their heart want to work together, that felt like they were consistently sort of learning the similar things, doing similar work, but not sharing information with each other. And so the notion if teachers can work together and schools can work together, certainly districts can in more meaningful ways. And that's the heart of our collaboration. We represent over 1 million students at 600 schools and 51,000 teachers. So a large, large organization. And Bob, if I get the next slide. So we're here obviously to talk about SEL today. And we have been, I think, a large part of a national conversation around SEL for two main reasons. One is the fact that we assess at such a large scale students on these competencies. And Noah will spend a lot of time this afternoon sort of walking you through what we assess and why we assess it and why we believe that's important. The next big thing is that we included as part of our accountability model. So just to prelude Noah's conversation, I want to talk a little bit about why it is that we did that. And so, Bob, if we can go to the next slide, you'll see sort of CORE's accountability model that we developed under a waiver. And as many of you may know, under NCLB waivers, the state of California did not receive a waiver, but we, the core districts, did. And so under that vehicle, so that umbrella, we developed a new and different accountability model. And our main thing, you sort of see that flashlight there. So our analogy of data should be a flashlight, not a hammer. Our whole theory behind what we were doing was thinking differently about what accountability was. It was less about punishing, and it was more about providing information to help us as systems learn and get better, to provide information to teachers. And if that is the purpose of an accountability system, if that's the purpose of what you're trying to do, then you think differently about what measures you want to include. And when we started to think about what we wanted to include, we started with asking all of our districts to go to their dashboards, not their AYP measures or in California or API measures, but what are on your dashboard that you and your local school boards are paying attention to see whether or not you're successful. And basically out of that came our accountability model, which you see on the screen here. And we felt that you can go back, Bob, I'll stay on that slide for a moment here. On there, you really see sort of a holistic view of lots of different measures that we think matter. And at the heart of it, we said, if you think it matters, if you want to pay attention to this, that's what we want to include. And to Bob's point earlier about the compelling evidence that SEL skills mattered, and that it was something that our districts wanted to pay attention to, it was something we included in our model. And you see, just real briefly, we have multiple academic indicators, achievement and growth, grad rates. We actually have a readiness indicator to know whether or not when you leave middle school, you're on track to graduate 4 years later. And then on the culture climate side, we look at things like absenteeism, and we actually do surveys, which we'll talk a bit about today, EL redesignation, special ed disproportionality, and suspension expulsion around disproportionality again, and then this notion of social emotional skills. So holistically, we believe when you look at all these measures together, if you're succeeding across all these measures, you're truly a school that is getting all your kids ready for life. And so there are things that we want to indicate as a system that we as schools should be paying attention to. And a critical part of that, for sure, is social emotional learning. I'll say at the beginning, as I turn it over to Noah, that we really view ourselves, and I'll talk at the end about we want to be a research pilot for the state. We truly believe ourselves as a pilot, and we're trying to figure these things out. I think, there's a lot of controversy on whether you should assess these skills, and certainly there's even more controversy whether it should be part of an accountability model. I believe if you define accountability the way we do, it makes sense. But even in that context, I think the real answer is we don't know, and that's part of what we're trying to figure out. I don't think you can say definitively for sure, yes, you should absolutely, or no, you shouldn't absolutely. I think it takes innovation and trying and seeing. And ultimately, we're getting some good results back, which say our teachers are actually finding value from the information. We're beginning to share information, learn from each other, and get better. And that really is what you would want out of a system. So with that, let me turn to Noah to sort of walk you through exactly what we're learning and how we're going. And so, Bob, if we can get the next slide.
Great. So what I'll do is just share briefly a little bit of what we focused on and how we got there, and a little bit about what we're learning. So a little over 3 years ago, we did receive this No Child Left Behind waiver, or ESSA waiver, and one of our first tasks was to figure out, so what are we going to focus on? Amongst all the possible skills, somebody called it the Tower of Babel of different social emotional skills that are out there, what are we going to focus on in the core districts? We landed on these 4, and our colleagues at Transforming Education helped us suss through the different options and engage with our district staff, along with our colleagues at the John Gardner Center for Youth at Stanford, to dial in these 4 skills: growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness. We selected these skills because or mindsets or attributes because they were things that we saw as being actionable. These are things that we think school districts and schools can do something about. We saw them as meaningful. As Bob showed earlier on, these are meaningfully related to the life outcomes we care about for our youth. and measurable. So we had some good evidence that you could actually measure these things and see what happens in terms of skill development over time. So that's how we landed on these four. And then we went through quite a process to first pilot these in the spring of 2014 in terms of a set of skills to assess with about 10,000 students across about 20 schools. And then in 2015, we field tested them with about 500,000 kids across all of our schools. And then in 2016, we again repeated our measurement effort. And if you go to the next slide, Bob, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about what's in our measurement tools, and then some of the initial evidence that we saw that made us feel confident that we're actually getting reasonably good information. So this is an example of our survey items or our survey scale with respect to self-management. We asked questions like, in the last 30 days, did you come to class prepared? Did you remember follow directions? And all these instruments, by the way, are available on both the core website as well as on the Transforming Education website. Just want to give you a flavor of the kinds of questions kids answer. And if we go to the next slide, I also want to mention that in addition to measuring social emotional skills, we think that looking at culture and climate in tandem with social emotional factors is really important. And so just as we assess social emotional skills, our students, parents, and staff also participate in surveys with respect to these areas of culture and climate. And on the next slide, just to give you a flavor for what some of those items look like, we provide some of the items with respect to support for academic learning for students. So adults at school encourage me to work hard so I can be successful, et cetera. So I also want to mention that. All right, next slide. So when we started to look at these data, we want to really make sure that they were reliable and valid. We ran a number of statistical tests to make sure that the measures were behaving the way we would expect them to. And so in this graph, for instance, we see the correlation or the relationship between each of the different survey topics and how they then relate to things like GPA or test scores or math scores or suspensions or absences. And we see that in general, these social emotional factors are related to these other outcomes and in the way that you'd expect. So students with higher mindsets tend to have stronger GPAs, math scores, ELA scores. They're less likely to be suspended and they're less likely to be absent. And so we see that with all the different skills. And that's part of what made us feel confident that these measures were telling us something meaningful. Next slide. We also saw the important relationship between student culture and climate ratings at a school. So that's along the y-axis here, the up and down. So these circles are all schools. Circles that are on the higher part of the graph here are cases of schools that have a stronger favorability around student culture and climate. And then left to right, we're looking at weaker to stronger social emotional factors. We generally see a strong correlation here, about 0.5, but not a perfect correlation. And it's noteworthy to see that there are schools with similar poverty levels. The two schools we point out here, both with 9 out of 10 kids in poverty, one with strong culture, climate, and strong social emotional factors, and one with challenges there. And we think that's important because it speaks to the actionability piece of this. Next slide. And we also see, as you saw in the previous correlations, the relationship between the social emotional factors and academic achievement. Importantly here, we're looking at school level math performance on the x-axis or on the horizontal axis. So left to right, lower performing schools in math on the left, higher performing on the right. And then stronger or weaker social emotional going up and down. And again, we see this relationship where schools tend to have stronger math, also tend to have stronger social emotional factors. So it's not a perfect relationship, meaning there is differentiation there. Next slide. So I want to turn it over to our executive, Rick Miller, who's going to talk about some of our interesting findings from our recent set of data. So, Rick.
Yeah, I'll just jump in a couple slides and then give it right back to Noah. So two interesting things, and we're just sort of trying to tease out what grabs us. So I found this particularly fascinating. So if you look at sort of growth mindset, you see this is the gap, the blue is males and the red is females. In growth mindset, there really is not much of a gap between the genders, a little bit in self-managed social awareness, but you look at self-efficacy, and you see this yawning gap as students enter middle school. And for females, for girls, as they hit middle school, their self-efficacy just absolutely plummets. I just found this striking and fascinating. I will tell you, as I've given speeches throughout the state on this, I find that when I raise this, I find all the females in the audience nod, of course, and all the males are like, huh, that's interesting. So I think this is not probably an unknown result, but I think what I like about this is this notion of as we begin to tease these things out, it can give tangible evidence to educators to do things differently and to target this. So as a middle school principal, I might think about self-efficacy for girls in a very different way than I did before. And now I have data to talk to my parents about why I'm doing this and what we're trying to accomplish. So this allows us to move instruction in a different way than we could have before. Another example, Bob, if you go to the next slide, looks at sort of, if you look at the top green bar, these are high achieving kids in mathematics, and they're low achieving kids in the red line, and the other looks at sort of your high SEL skills. And what we sort of see here is there's this sort of gap that you would expect: high achieving kids and high SEL skills, low achieving kids and low SEL skills. That sort of goes like this, as you would expect. But at the very end there in 11th grade, you see that gap sort of really close in a meaningful way, which struck us as odd. But as we begin to sort of unpack it, what we found, not surprisingly, was kids who had low SEL skills and low academic skills were gone. Like they would drop out. So you only had left the kids with high SEL skills and low test scores. So what that argues is, I would think this argues, is if we really start paying attention to SEL in particular in the middle and early high school years, that may be the best thing we could do to keep kids on track and keep them focused on graduation. So again, these gives us tangible ways to use SEL skills in our current academic settings to further ourselves to get at the goals that we've shared together as institutions for years. So with those two, I like to do the fun, interesting ones. I'll turn it back to Noah for the rest.
I feel like everything I get to do is fun too, Rick. So, but those are pretty fun slides. All right, let's take it to the next slide, Bob. All right, I think we're working on pulling up the next piece here. The next thing that we wanted to share with you all is just talk a little bit about where we're headed as an organization. So Rick mentioned a little bit about our history. We are a collaborative of school districts. Our first set of work about 5-6 years ago is really focused on learning together. We brought together leaders of curriculum instruction from across our districts who are all learning about implementing the Common Core for the first time. So we built those relationships, we leveraged them, engaged in some role-like work. The last couple of years, 2-3 years, we've been implementing this waiver, which has driven our work as a collaborative largely. So we've worked carefully to develop these measures, to develop intervention and improvement systems for schools, where we do things like pair schools together or engage in cycles of improvement. And we've also built something of an infrastructure, both in terms of the different groups of folks from across these districts who are working together, but also in terms of our data and analytics capacity. And so we're now taking the next step of not just finding this data intriguing and interesting, but seeing how we collectively as a collaborative can use it to drive change or improvement. And to do that, we're going to be focusing in on a specific area. If you go to the next slide, just to tell you a little bit about what we're up to, we looked at a few different areas that we as a collaborative might focus on as a group and put all of our energy into seeing if we could drive improvement. And this shows you our process. And then ultimately, we landed on this topic by collaborating with the districts that we're going to be really heavily focused on improving mathematics proficiency for our African American, Latino, Hispanic, Latino youth in grades 4 to 8. We're going to be leveraging the tools of improvement science to do that, things like cycles of improvement, what have you. And I want to share one data point that talks about why that's so compelling. And then I want to talk about the idea that we intend to use social emotional skills as one of the key drivers that we look at and try to leverage in improving the performance of these historically underperforming groups. So if we go to the next slide, one of the reasons why we feel particularly compelled to zero in on race as a challenge area is that we see in our own data, and I'm going to show you first some achievement data, but then I'm going to show you some similar trends with social emotional skills, that when we looked, the pluses here are youth in poverty, the squares are youth not in poverty. And if we compare youth who are not in poverty, who are African American, and their average score on the California assessments, they actually perform lower than white youth who are in poverty. That is, white youth who are in poverty outperform African American youth who are not in poverty. And so that really speaks to this challenge that we recognized we had in our districts, but these data help compel us to choose that as a focal area that we're going to be working on instead of districts. And if you go to the next slide, the idea in this work around improvement science is we can only improve these things by identifying drivers that we can then address. And so one of the drivers that we intend to address around closing this gap is to look at social emotional skills, things like self-management and mindsets of our youth as a way that we could actually try to drive improvement with respect to our African American, Hispanic, Latino youth. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see exactly why we think these things are related. So again, we're looking at our African American youth against our white youth. And at this time, what we're doing is we're looking at it in terms of these social emotional factors. Once again, the youth not in poverty are the squares, and then the plus signs are for youth in poverty. And we see that for African American youth, their mindsets and their self-efficacy are about on par when you compare African American youth not in poverty to white youth in poverty. And then we see really wide gaps in terms of the perceived self-management and social awareness skills of our African American youth when we compare that to white youth, even if we disentangle this poverty issue. And so we see this as a potentially really important lever to driving change in math performance and in academic performance of these youth. We do see the same trends. I won't go through it in depth on the next slide with respect to our Hispanic Latino youth. But again, we see these trends where there's this gap in the social emotional factors that we think is a really appropriate place for us to address some of our important work. One of the ways, if you go to the next slide, that we're doing that is to look at variability. So as our friends at the Carnegie Foundation like to say, when we're looking at trying to drive improvement, the critical issue is not what works, but rather what works for whom and under what conditions. And the idea here is that the real problem in our schools is not entirely to do with the overall performance, but rather the differences in performance. Even within these results, we have some schools that are doing quite well and some schools that are quite challenged. At the core districts, we do that by looking at growth. And so we look at student level growth where we compare students to their academic peers. Here, you're seeing a classic example of looking at academic growth versus academic achievement. But we are taking that a step further, if we go to the next slide, and starting to explore how you can think about growth with respect to these social emotional factors. How do we look at how an individual student's responses change year over year, controlling for their prior year results, their gender, ethnicity, English learner status, et cetera. And we're starting to see, if we go to the next slide, some meaningful information. This is a high level version of what we're starting to see, but we can start to think about schools both in terms of their growth or impact on academic factors, as well as their growth or impact on test scores. And that is going to allow us to look at different kinds of schools, like School A examples, where schools are gaining ground in a particular SEL skill, students relative to their peers, but academic growth is slower, or like D, where students are losing ground on the SEL skill, but academic growth is faster. And so this is, we think, ripe territory for us to better understand what's happening in our schools, understand our strengths and challenges, and to address those and to address that variation. We're going to specifically be focusing on math performance of youth of color, but we see our districts taking on other areas of focus as well. And with that, I'm going to transition back to Rick, who's going to talk a little about why we think it's important to continue playing this out in an accountability and a research context, and then he'll turn it over to Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So as our hope as we move from NCLB to ESSA, thinking about what role we play in California. So California's been doing a lot of deep thinking around our new generation of accountability, but like any state, they're hobbled by what they, a limited data set and a limited ability to impact. And so we actually at core collect much more data than the state does. Obviously, SEL is a perfect example. The state just does not collect that. And I think, frankly, has a great lack of comfort at the state level to begin moving that direction. So our hope is to become a research pilot for the state in the context of accountability. So you would have a system where we would all have the exact same indicators. Whatever the state comes up with, we would share those metrics. But in addition, we would look at other metrics, and then but they would incorporate that into our accountability to better understand, if you looked at SEL, what would that mean? And so we take this in a sense from some of our best district, like Long Beach Unified, for example. They pilot all the time. They rarely take something, any curricular, any change, and rarely take it across the district before trying it in a few schools, seeing if it works. And if it works, then they raise it. And if it doesn't, then they let it go. And so we sort of want to build on that model, but across a system. And so you could see us continuing. We would continue to look at SEL and count that for accountability. So an example of what that means for counting for accountability is, if you look at, say, the bottom 5% under ESSA, so the state would maybe sort of say, based on our numbers, we think, 25, 30 schools from the core districts would be part of the bottom 5%, but then we would use our measure to determine which those bottom 5%. So we may end up with a different subset than what the state, we'd have the same N size, we have the same number of schools, but we become different schools based on what we're learning from our schools. And we think actually looking at more robust multiple measures like growth and like SEL, we will better identify the schools that need the greatest assistance. And also this would allow us to continue to use this for accountability purposes, which we like, in other words, to test out. So I actually saw one question in the chat box from Todd talking about the notion that if we use these measures, for accountability, it could change the outcomes, and it could. It's important to note is as long as we were assessing these, it never actually counted for accountability because we were still building it. So one thing we're quite concerned about is if we included this in accountability, it could cause unintended consequences where teachers could or students could begin to game the system, if you were, because they thought it would impact their accountability model, which would be the exact opposite of what we wanted. And then we would have to pull out and we have to rethink that. But we want to continue to learn. We think in a holistic accountability model that's about improvement, we think we can make this work and make it work for the benefit of teachers and students. And that's what we're trying to test. So I think, Todd, to your question, I think what you'll hear us say a lot, we don't know. And we're not sure what that would mean, but we want to sort of test it in this pilot version and then sort of scale it from there. A critical part of what we're trying to learn and how we're doing this is partnering with research. And so Heather Huff is the executive director of our Core PACE partnership, where not only are we sort of collecting these additional measures, learning the things, but we're actually working with researchers to do quantitative and qualitative researchers in our district to say, what does it mean? So if you use SEL and accountability model, rather than just sort of look at the data that comes back, we actually want to go into the schools and sort of say, again, quantitative and qualitatively, what happened? Like, you as a teacher, what did you do differently as a result of this? And so it's part of our vast learning agenda is what we're trying to do. And with that, to talk about that, let me turn it over to Heather to talk about our partnership.
Thanks, Rick. So as Rick pointed out, the districts came together to measure SEL because they believed that it better represented the goals that they had for their students. But there are so many questions around the measurement that core innovating and being out in front to measure not just social emotional learning and culture climate, but also growth, chronic absenteeism, suspension, the full host of measures in their system. Nobody learns from that without a really strong research infrastructure, both to help them understand internally what those measures mean, but also to share that learning externally. And with that, our research partnership at Policy Analysis for California Education is really focused on both of those goals, simultaneously understanding the measures and their use and the work of the core districts together to inform continuous improvement, to help them strengthen their activity together in collaboration, but also to take those learnings and present them to a broader audience to help inform policy, both here in California, which is a strong focus for us, but also in Washington and across the country as states and districts everywhere are grappling with exactly how to measure things appropriately. Next slide, please. The way that we do that is through a blend of quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis that is where one is constantly informing the other. Our belief is that in understanding measures and their use, you really have to have work on the ground to understand implementation, but also work with these measures to be able to uncover some of the patterns that Rick and Noah discussed. So to that end, our quantitative work is designed to uncover the patterns, to explore variation across schools, within student groups, and to analyze outcomes. And our qualitative analysis work helps us to dig into that, what we're seeing in the quantitative data, to understand implementation in the districts and in the schools to highlight promising practices that then can be spread across the collaborative and to explain some of the variation that we're seeing in the quantitative analysis. Next slide. And so we launched this research partnership just last year to support the core district's work, and I'm going to discuss very briefly the work that we completed in our first year, which we can, if anyone has questions about this, we can dig into it in the question and answer, and then what we have planned for the year ahead. So as you all know, we've had a pretty substantial policy transition this year, and I suspect it will continue over the next year. And so a lot of our focus in this year, in addition to the continuous improvement, our focus on policy has been a bit bigger as the regulations under ESSA have been drafted, and as folks in our state are trying to figure out how they should think about measurement. And how they should think about pilots like what we're proposing in the core district as a way to learn from what's happening locally, to aggregate that up to something that we can implement or at least learn about in a consistent way at the state level. So on the quantitative side in this year, we've done a couple of pieces with CORE's expanded measurement system, exploring how chronic absenteeism and CORE's smaller subgroup size, what that means for an accountability measurement system. And both of those pieces were actually cited in policy, both at the state and federal level. We also recently completed a study in August, which I'll post in the box for anyone to access on our website, looking at how a multiple measure system can be used to identify schools for improvement under ESSA. And this one is very important because CORE is, just to underscore what Rick and Noah have said, really unique in the number of things that have been measured and how many students are represented in these districts, over 1 million kids. And so when the regulations came out, there are a lot of questions about what this means. How can we include multiple measures in an accountability system, particularly for providing support to schools? And one of our big findings with regards to social emotional learning is that what ESSA refers to as the fifth indicator, in the way that the draft regulations were written, actually requires that they have nearly no weight in the system. So it requires that something in the school quality and student success domain is measured, but then simultaneously says, but we can't count it. And we know from decades of accountability research that measures without any teeth, measures that don't count, just aren't treated the same as measures that are used in the accountability system and that count, that people have to pay attention to them differently. And to underscore, again, something that Rick said, that's part of the rationale for the research pilot, is that if you want to understand how measures are used in an accountability system, you actually have to study them in an accountability system. And the last piece of work that will be released later this fall is a really important look at how the social emotional learning and culture climate measures are related to one another and what they reveal about school performance. So, there are well-documented risks to measuring social emotional learning at scale. And what our research now and into the future is designed to look at is if we know that social emotional learning is important, we have to aggregate that into the school level and look at whether and how schools contribute to the development of these measures in addition to their underlying constructs, and what it tells us about how schools are doing. Because without understanding how these measures relate to other measures of of school performance, you can't utilize them in a continuous improvement framework. And so that's a big part of what we have been focusing on with that report coming out later this fall. And then finally, on the qualitative side, we completed an implementation study of the core districts, really focused on the implementation and effect of including new measures in the core accountability system, in addition to how the districts were supporting school improvement within the districts. And again, I would encourage anyone to take a look at both our policy brief and the full report. But what we found is that the districts really appreciated that there were increased measures that represented the things that they believed in and the things that they cared about. And also that having all of these measures in the same set for accountability or being reported at the district level made them count, even if they didn't have formal teeth under the waiver. That people appreciated that they could now have, if you've had a department that works on student services, that those people are now part of the conversation around school improvement in a way that they weren't before. So next slide, Bob. And the last thing I'll talk about before we get into questions is for the year ahead, we have a very large agenda around better understanding the social emotional learning and culture climate measures. This past year, 15-16, was only the second year that the core districts measured these constructs. And we still have huge questions about how these measures are working and whether or not they should be continued to be measured. These questions fall into two buckets, which are each quite large. One of them is around measure reliability and validity. So with 1 year of data, we did quite a bit of this work, also with Marty West and his team at CEPR at Harvard, showing that there is evidence that these indicators are reliable within constructs, that they are constant within subgroups, and also that they do measure something different, that you can distinguish between schools. But we still have a huge set of questions about, someone asked a question about culturally responsive questions. That's one of the sets of questions that we have. Our students, we're seeing these huge gaps in student subgroup, but we don't know whether that's because of an actual difference in the construct or a different way that students in different subgroups are answering these questions. So that's one of the questions. Also, are the constructs that we measured psychometrically different? We say that we're measuring self-management. We say that we're measuring growth, but we really want to dig into all of those things to understand how different these constructs are. So we have a huge bucket of work around that. And then the other piece is that with 2 years of data, we're now able to start looking at growth. And so there were some preliminary findings that NOAA showed around growth in academic versus growth in social emotional learning. We're going to really dig into that in this year, and especially in the next year, once we have 3 years of data. Every year strengthens that. But for us to better understand if students' SEL changes and if schools are contributing to that change. And then we can really start to get at this question about how these measures are actionable. That in order for them to really be actionable, we have to be able to do something that moves them. And so understanding how they're changing over time is key to that. So before we get into questions, I just want to say there are a lot of questions with these measures, but in working with CORE's partners and also with a network of researchers across the state here in California, which is PACE's model, our goal is to use CORE's innovation to really accelerate the learning. So this isn't something cool that one set of districts is doing, but rather pioneering work that they're doing that we can all learn from very, very quickly.
I think we're done at that point. Bob, we'll turn back to you. The one thing I also I should add, because I mentioned CORE, who CORE was, the 8 districts. We've also opened up our data system, though, to any LEA in the state, or I guess country for that matter, that wants to join us. So we've added actually over 800,000 kids into our system. Some will access this SEL, so we'll even build beyond our districts the number of students who are participating in this process. And with that, Bob, I'll turn it back over to you.
I think we've lost Bob.
Perfect timing.
Oh,
right?
No, there he is. Cut out one more time. Sorry. So I don't know if my question got through, but I wanted to pose to the group here, and thank you again, Rick, Noah, and Heather, for that presentation. We've got a couple questions on the local level. There's one question that we want to ask a little more broadly. How do you think ESSA has affected the conversation around SEL measurement?
Well, I would say that I think there is there's chicken and egg, but I do think that ESSA has had an important impact. I think part of why ESSA included this 5th indicator is precisely because of the groundswell around measuring things beyond test scores. So I think that what people were doing on the ground is what led to the policy, but the policy has led to an increased focus and also warrant around measuring things that either were being thought about before or weren't being measured at scale before. So I think that it has been very impactful and has definitely, over the past year, increased the number of people involved in conversations about measurement in social emotional learning and the speed with which people are thinking about how to develop and utilize measures.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, I mean, just by including the fifth indicator, I think Congress clearly sent a message that there's a desire and an interest in paying attention to other measures like SEL. And I think there was broad consensus. They were thinking of SEL when they included that. So, so I think it's really pushed us in a good direction. Again, cautiously in a good direction. I think we need to learn more before we go, but we're in the right direction. I think that there was this concern, that Heather raised around the fifth indicator under the current regs. I also think, frankly, with this new administration, I mean, we'll just call it as no one has, I think the regs are written, likely are not going to last much longer, and we have no idea what's to come after. So, but what does seem to be a consensus in this new administration is that there's going to be less federal oversight than we've seen in a long, long time. So this actually gives more ability and more need for states and districts to innovate and to use this opportunity to provide as much information for the public common good as we can. And that's sort of certainly our philosophy.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'd like to add there, and it goes a little bit beyond just assessment, but I think in Title IV and some of the block grants that have been established that provide a lot of flexibility for states to do work around SEL interventions or programming. I think there's also some opportunities to use that for measurement as well, possibly. So there's a lot of flexibility that ESSA provides, and I think that's encouraging and creating more conversations about how it can be applied to social emotional learning. We have one question here that one of the attendees is curious to learn more about how schools specifically are incorporating SEL measures into their local assessment systems.
Yeah, I think, well, one of the things is there's increased demand for that. So many of our districts are asking and are trying to figure out how can we support schools in assessing these skills more frequently. And so there's definitely some work underway about that. We at CORE are collaborating with our colleagues at Transferring Ed and our colleagues at CASEL to sort of help identify the assessments that are out there and identify the next generation of assessments that folks might want to consider. And then the other thing that I'll mention here is that some of our districts are starting to experiment with changing the way their elementary report cards are done as a way to assess these skills more frequently at scale. And so they're looking at assessing these social emotional skills through the report card. In fact, there's an op-ed in today's, I think it's in the San Francisco Examiner by the acting superintendent in San Francisco about just that topic. And so those are some things that are happening locally to assess these skills on a more frequent basis.
I'll talk a little more about that because I love to talk more about this, as Noah knows. So what I found interesting about that was, we have these 4 skill sets, SEL skill sets that Noah mentioned. And when San Francisco sort of started assessing these and learning about them, they went back and they looked at their elementary report card, and they found when examining it that 85%. Actually, I should stop and say, we've always had behavior marks on report cards. That's not new. But when they looked at the behavior they were paying attention to, 85% was related to self-management, which I really view as, you behave as opposed to let's all build up the skill sets we need to have highly effective kids in the classroom. And so as a result, San Francisco sort of said, let's rethink that. And now they're reporting equally across all 4 domains of growth mindset and self-advocacy to think differently about how they communicate to parents about what they're trying to do as a system. And I think that's a good example of how we can use these benefits. So Bob, with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. One question I think on that part, maybe you could talk a little bit about just, I think, formative assessments in general, as opposed to some of these measures being incorporated into a formal accountability system.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, well, a couple of things. So one, locally, a couple of our districts are associating these skills with their local formal accountability system. So our colleagues in Oakland are doing that. We at CORE, our perspective on this is this was going to be part of our accountability system under ESSA. Now we're looking at this research pilot, but our philosophy here is we think it's appropriate to try using these as a part of accountability only under the circumstance that the accountability system itself is about improvement, and the data are about improvement and not about labeling schools and the more draconian kinds of things. we think it's worth trying. And the reason we think that, I worked in the Los Angeles Unified School District for a number of years, as well as in Oakland. And, when it comes down to what schools pay attention to, what they prioritize, it's what they're being held accountable for. So that's where a principal is going to put their investments and energies. And so that's why we think it's worthy to think about these in the context of accountability. There's a risk that if they're only considered as secondary, that they'll be treated that way. And so our hypothesis is, if you put them on the same page with the academic measures and the chronic absence and what have you, that opens up the possibility that schools can prioritize them alongside the important work to improve reading and math.
And I should also add that all of our districts too are doing their own individual exploration with these SEL skills and how to assess them and sort of learn from them. In particular, Sacramento City Unified and Oakland Unified have been a longtime participant with Roger Weisberg and his great work with the Castle districts. And so I think there's a lot of learning coming out that we're all trying to share back.
Yeah, I'll respond to a question in the chat box too about how has this work influenced what accountability means and what measurement for accountability and continuous improvement mean. And I think particularly here in California, our state is really focusing on expanding the definition of accountability and thinking about multiple sources of accountability. So we're coming out of a period where accountability was, how you received sanctions based on your data. And there still will be that aspect under ESSA. But the idea of continuous improvement is that you're held accountable to various stakeholders and that the data helps to illuminate that. So it's not just that you receive a sanction or you receive support or intervention. It's also that, if you report publicly something like social-emotional learning, then your parents can say, look, we want you to pay more attention to this because we're low on it and maybe it'll help if we pay attention. And that way of thinking about measurement is something that is, that line of thinking is very prominent right now in California.
Great, and I think with that, I'd like to ask you all how you see CORE's work informing California policy over, say, the next 5 or 10 years.
Great, and so I heard one thing that maybe we're having trouble hearing, Bob. I don't know if that's still the case anymore, but I'll repeat the question just in case that isn't the fact. And the question was about how we see this informing California policy moving forward. And again, I think that this notion that we sort of mentioned before of hey Bob, now you're we can hear you, so maybe if you can. So we finally heard you when you didn't want to be heard. It's the way these webinars work. So is that, again, this notion of piloting, I think SEL is a perfect example of, we're really comfortable with what we're learning and what we're doing and how this is helping our schools, but we equally, you've heard us say multiple times, I don't think this is ready for prime time. We don't know enough around to bring this. And I think that notion of a sanctioned way for a subset of districts to consistently learn and get better. Another part of what we've talked about internally is that, and I've tasked, Noah's working on this, and Heather, is this notion of, I showed you that slide with it, about 10 measures that we're paying attention to. We want to be constantly looking at those measures and sort of seeing, do they work? So for instance, we have an EL reclassification rate that we look at that was very much intended to make sure that we don't reclassify too early. There's no research that says the first 5 years, going the first year versus the 5th year is advantageous to the child. Lots of research to say after the 5 years, you need to get them reclassified. So we tried to create a system that encouraged that. What we want to test is, did it work? Did we actually incentivize the things we wanted to incentivize? And if we didn't incentivize them, let's redo that. So we with our partnership with PACE can actually learn from our measures in meaningful ways, and then we give that back to the state because they're lacking resources and the ability to do a lot of that assessment. So we can actually provide that back to the state. I think that's the role that we, as an example, would like to play. But I actually think districts throughout the state can play in California and throughout the country. And I would highly encourage states not to think of themselves as we control it all, but think about how to use their districts to help inform them and make all of us better.
Yeah, and I'll add that California has taken this idea of local control very seriously, but the idea of local control is also something that is built into ESSA. And so there are a lot of ways in which this shift doesn't just shift the control to the states, but also down to the local level. And California, their focus on local control predated ESSA, and as such, they've done a lot of thinking about what the state role should be in it. And I think that part of what they're coming around to is that the state is a broker of knowledge and resources, and not an organization that kind of sets things from the top and makes people do them in a compliance framework. And the work of CORE has been held up as an example of the kind of local innovation and research that they'd like to see happen more often. Oh, now I can't hear Bob.
Bob, I think you're muted.
He was being good though, because he didn't want to type into it. Yeah, there you go.
So we have a couple of minutes left here, and I just wanted to see if any of you had any kind of closing statements about the work of CORE, or anything in light of ESSA that you wanted to share with the rest of the attendees here.
As all my colleagues think about their question, one thing I did see a question from Karen that I did want to just answer, which is the question:
sure.
do we survey teachers as part of this? And the answer is no in the way you're asking it, but yes, sort of. Which say we don't ask teachers about their perceptions, their growth mindset, their self-efficacy, but we do ask some of our teachers about their view of their students. So in Fresno and in Santa Ana, they've agreed to do some of their teachers, to survey some or all of their teachers, which is ideal if we can get that to, because you learn more by including that. And like one thing we found, which I kind of early on but found kind of interesting, is that it appears that you don't lose your skills as you move from classroom to classroom. So if you have low self-management or high self-management, it doesn't change from Mr. Jones's class to Mrs. Johnson's, which is interesting, and sort of we want to continue. So the more information we have, the better we're going to be. But that's sort of the direction we're going. And then I'll sort of end and turn to Noah and Heather at the end to say again, I think I've tried to stress this again and again, is this is to us is a big learning opportunity. We understand the controversy of including these measures in accountability. We understand why people would be concerned. And again, what I will often say is that may prove to be true. I could certainly see a vision where this is not a good idea to include this in accountability, but I flatly reject the notion that educators should not learn, and that we shouldn't try to figure out and not assume that we know before we test things in a responsible and usable way. And I think that's what we're trying to accomplish, and we're excited to continue to move down our learning journey, and we would hope that to inform others as they consider this as well.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate all those comments. I think we have a few minutes. I want to make sure we address a couple of the other questions that came up. Todd had asked about employability skills and whether or not we think that's synonymous with these social emotional factors. We definitely think there's a relationship there. Clearly, things like self-management, self-efficacy, highly related to being social awareness, are thought of in some scenarios as 21st century or employability skills. It's something we're keenly intrigued and aware of, and part of why we want to focus on these skills. We at CORE are also in a partnership with the Linked Learning Alliance in California, which you might think of as like next generation career-based education, where high school youth are in a theme-based high school experience where they explicitly focus on building their education is linked to career themes. And so one of the reasons why the districts that are involved in that are also involved in CORE is because of this alignment and this interest around this piece. Earlier on, I think I saw a question too about, have we looked at bias in these measures or cultural, are these culturally sensitive measures? And we did look pretty carefully at the reliability of these measures across different racial and ethnic groups. So from a technical perspective, we tested this pretty carefully. There's another step that we may end up taking where we actually try to do focus groups and things like that around the surveys to see if that sort of quality of measurement that we see from a technical perspective also shows up when you go more qualitative in the review. But we feel pretty good about these measures.
I'd also add, though, before you finish, just to say that we certainly also hope that the next step, which is that our response is culture responsive, right? So that when we think about what we're going to do with this information, we go into the classroom to improve. I think that's where it's most important that we're paying attention to the cultural needs of our students. As we look at the African American achievement gap, we have to be cognizant and pay attention to that. So sorry, no, I'll turn it back.
Yeah, and then I think in the big picture here, there's one thing I've learned in doing a bunch of different reform kind of initiatives. This stuff just takes time, and so this work we're trying to do around social emotional skills embedded into the way schools work, I think is phenomenally worthy effort. It's just going to take time for it to really play out. And my wish for our districts, I love the idea of a 5-year time horizon, and that we get to continue doing this work for another 5 years, because I think that's at minimum how long it will take for us to really understand where it works well, where the challenges are, how to address those, and what have you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick, Noah, and Heather. I believe we've run out of time, everybody, but again, we so appreciate this conversation, and we're so happy you could join us today. Again, we will be making this webinar, it is recorded, and we will be making it available. We will email it out to all participants. And I know there was also a question in there about whether these slides would be made available, and we can also do that as well. So again, thank you everybody for attending. And if you have any questions about this, please, you can email me at bob@transformingeducation.org. And thank you, and have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks all.
Goodbye.
Bye.